In the grand tapestry of history, some threads are woven with steel and dyed in blood. They tell stories not of kings and queens in their opulent courts, but of the grim instruments of their will. This is one of those stories. Imagine, if you will, the world in the year 1458. It is an age of brutal contradiction. A time of breathtaking Renaissance art and poetry. Yet also an era of savage, unrelenting warfare. In the West, the kingdoms of France and England licked their wounds after a century of conflict. The Holy Roman Empire, a patchwork of feuding princes and electors, is a giant stirring fitfully in its sleep. To the east, however, there is no sleep. There is only the storm. Just 5 years earlier, in 1453, the unthinkable happened. The great city of Constantinople, the bastion of Eastern Christendom for 1,000 years, had fallen to the armies of Sultan Mehmed II. The conqueror. Now, his gaze, and the might of his seemingly invincible empire, was fixed on the heart of Europe, and the gateway to that heart was the Kingdom of Hungary. Hungary stood on a knife's edge, a bulwark against a tide that threatened to consume it. It was a kingdom in mourning. A kingdom of political intrigue. And a kingdom in desperate need of a savior. It would find one not in a seasoned-old monarch, but in a boy. A boy who would inherit a legacy of war and forge an army unlike any Europe had ever seen. This is the story of Matthias Corvinus and the birth of his legendary Fekete Sere, the Black Army. To understand why the Black Army was necessary, one must first understand the profound crisis facing Hungary. For decades, the kingdom had been Europe's front line, the shield of Christendom. This was not a distant, theoretical threat. It was a daily reality, etched into the lives of everyone living near the southern frontier, a bloody borderland of constant, low-level warfare. Ottoman raiding parties, the dreaded akinci, would sweep across the border to pillage, burn, and carry off thousands into slavery. How did Hungary defend itself? With a system that was centuries old, born of a different time, and for a different kind of enemy. The Feudal Levy. When the king called the banners, every nobleman was obligated to raise a certain number of soldiers from his own lands and serve for a limited time, typically 3 months a year. These were farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants, not professional soldiers. They would fight with courage, yes, but they lacked the discipline, the standardized equipment, and the year-round readiness of their Ottoman counterparts. And what an enemy they faced. The Ottoman army was a state-of-the-art military machine. At its core were the Janissaries, an elite infantry corps of slave soldiers, raised from childhood to know nothing but war and loyalty to the Sultan. They were supported by professional cavalry, the Sipahis, and a formidable artillery train that had shattered the supposedly unbreakable walls of Constantinople. How could Hungarian farmers, who needed to be back home for the harvest, possibly compete with this? The weaknesses of the feudal system had been laid bare in catastrophic defeats. At the Battle of Varna, a crusading army led by Matthias's own father was annihilated. The lesson was brutal and clear. Courage without professionalism was not enough. The old ways were leading Hungary to its doom. The kingdom needed a standing army. A permanent, paid, professional force that answered not to 100 different barons, but to one man, the king. And what a king he was. Matthias Hunyadi, known to history as Matthias Corvinus, from the raven Corvus on his coat of arms, ascended to the throne in 1458 at the tender age of 14. He was no pampered prince. He was the son of John Hunyadi, the great scourge of the Turks, a national hero who had spent his life fighting the Ottomans. But his heroic lineage was as much a curse as a blessing. The powerful magnates of Hungary, the fabulously wealthy barons who controlled vast swathes of the kingdom, feared the Hunyadi family's power. After John Hunyadi's death, they moved against his sons. Matthias's older brother was publicly beheaded. Matthias himself was thrown in prison in Prague, a political pawn in their games. He only became king through a complex political bargain, essentially ransomed and placed on the throne by a faction of lesser nobles who were tired of the magnates' tyranny. So from day one, Matthias understood two fundamental truths. First, the Ottomans were an existential threat from without. Second, the Hungarian magnates were an existential threat from within. They sought to keep the crown weak, and the king dependent on their whims and their private armies. If he called the Feudal Levy, who was to say they would even show up? Or that they wouldn't turn their forces against him if it suited their interests? Matthias knew that to survive, to truly rule and defend his kingdom, he couldn't rely on their power. He had to build his own. But how does a teenage king with a depleted treasury forge a new army from scratch? He looks for opportunity. And the greatest opportunity lay just across the border, in the lands of Bohemia and the fallout of the bloody Hussite Wars. For nearly 2 decades, the Kingdom of Bohemia had been a crucible of military innovation. The Hussites, fighting for religious and national sovereignty against the might of the Holy Roman Empire, had revolutionized warfare. Unable to field large numbers of traditional knights, they perfected combined arms tactics. They used mobile wagon forts to protect their infantry, and they embraced gunpowder. Their armies were filled with hardened commoners who had repeatedly defeated the greatest knightly hosts of Europe. By the 1452nd, the wars had cooled down, but the soldiers remained. Thousands upon thousands of them, Czechs, Germans, Poles, Silesians, veterans who knew only battle, now unemployed, and very, very dangerous. Matthias saw his chance. These men were not loyal to a lord or a nation, they were loyal to the contract. They were loyal to the man who could guarantee them steady pay. He sent his recruiters across Central Europe with chests of gold florins, hiring them by the thousands. Captains like the Czech Franz Hag or Black John Haugwitz brought their entire companies into Matthias's service. They were joined by rebellious Hungarian commoners, Serbian refugees, and disillusioned nobles. A river of steel flowed into Hungary, a torrent of military expertise ready to be channeled by the young king. And so, the Fekete Sereg, the Black Army, was born. The exact origin of the name is lost to time, shrouded in legend. The most common theory is that it came from the black armor its soldiers wore, perhaps a practical, unpolished steel, or a dark lacquer that gave them a uniform, terrifying appearance. Another popular story claims the name came from the court wearing black in mourning for Matthias's father, a name that simply stuck to his new force. Some historians point to its first commander, Black John Haugwitz, as the source. But perhaps the truest reason for the name was the black reputation they would soon earn on the battlefields of Europe. This was no mere mercenary rabble. What Matthias created was something revolutionary for its time. He didn't just hire soldiers, he forged them into a single, cohesive weapon. The Black Army was arguably Europe's first permanent professional standing national army since the Roman legions. Its composition was a masterclass in 15th century combined arms. Was the heavy cavalry, the traditional fist of any medieval army. Clad in magnificent plate armor, they were the shock troops designed to shatter enemy formations. But crucially, it also featured large numbers of light cavalry, the famous Hungarian hussars. Inheriting tactics from the steppe peoples, they were the eyes and ears of the army, perfect for scouting, raiding, and pursuing a broken enemy. The true heart of the army, however, was its infantry. Huge, disciplined formations of pikemen could create an unbreakable wall of steel, neutralizing the threat of an enemy nightly charge. And supporting them was the future of warfare. The Black Army had one of the highest ratios of firearms of any army in Europe at the time. These arquebusiers, while slow to load, delivered a psychological and physical shock that could demoralize and break even the most veteran opponents. What held this diverse multinational force together? Two things: discipline and money. Soldiers in the Black Army were paid regular, handsome wages in stable gold currency directly from the royal treasury. This was almost unheard of. It meant their loyalty was not to a feudal baron who might pay them with promises or land, but to King Matthias himself. To fund this enormous expense, Matthias ruthlessly reformed the kingdom's tax system, imposing new levies that made him deeply unpopular with the nobility and clergy, but which he knew were essential for the kingdom's survival. Finally, there was the artillery. Matthias was obsessed with this new technology. He hired foreign masters to build him a massive and mobile artillery train. with powerful siege cannons to batter down the walls of rebel barons and Ottoman fortresses, and lighter field guns that could be deployed in battle to support his infantry. The Black Army didn't just march, it rolled forward with the power of thunder. Discipline, regular pay, combined arms, a centralized command, gunpowder, and artillery. In a few short years, Matthias had taken a kingdom on the verge of collapse and given it the most modern military force in Christendom. It was an army built not on feudal obligation, but on royal authority and cold, hard cash. It was an engine of war, loyal only to its creator. But an instrument of this power and expense cannot be left idle. It must be used. And Matthias Corvinus was a man of boundless ambition. He had forged this weapon to defend Hungary, but he soon realized it could do so much more. It could expand his power, crush his rivals, and carve out an empire of his own. The Black Army was about to be unleashed. The training was over. The forging was complete. Now, it was time for war. And its first true tests would come not against the Sultan in the south, but against fellow Christian kings in the north and west. Next time, we march with the Black Army into its first campaigns and witness the brutal efficiency